green to North Carolina's pines. They walk those miles with hope still in their minds. With every step, the pain was hard to bear. Yet through the tears, they chose to persevere. In Tennessee, they felt the river's cold embrace. Their spirit strong, no hardship could erase. The land of ancestors fading in their view, but their hearts held firm, love for what they knew. On the trail of tears where sorrow met the land, they carried dreams within a calloused hand. In Oklahoma, they found strength in pain, survived the journey through the snow and rain.
First of all, I'm Larry Smith from the Alabama chapter, and I am just honored to introduce our guest speaker, who did research on her doctoral dissertation a few years ago in Guntersville, where I live. And she was doing research on the Brown family, which is one of the most famous Cherokee families of national fame. Emma was like a breath of fresh air after dealing with all of you old folks over the years. But anyway, she is wise beyond her years. Mm-hmm. Consider her background in education. She has a Bachelor of Arts, cum laude from Smith College, Northampton, Massachusetts, a Master of Philosophy from the University of Cambridge, United Kingdom, and her most recent degree, Doctor of Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. For those who don't know about Penn, they are the college that does not have a really good football team. They are known for their academics. Her dissertation is 400 pages long, which she will go into. And she has been a presenter at national organizations, received numerous awards, and although she is highly educated and speaks 5 languages, she is one of the most nicest, approachable people I've ever met. Please welcome Dr. Emma Curry-Stodder.
Wow, what an intro. Thank you. Wow. I wouldn't go so far as to say I speak 5 languages, but I'm familiar. Yeah. But thank you for that amazing introduction. Geez, hope I can live up to it. Okay, so I'm going to do my presentation, and then I'm going to try to leave like 10 minutes at the end for questions. Okay, so the title of my dissertation and my presentation is That I May Become Useful to My Dear People, Catharine Brown, the Brown Family, and Cherokee Christianity in the Era of Removal. So I'll just get started. On March 8th, 1820, Catharine Brown closed her letter to Isabella Hall with an exhortation for them both to be faithful to our Lord and do much in the world. She then added a final postscript concerning Isabella's 15-month-old daughter. Quote, "Oh, how much I want to see my little Jenna and hear her talk. Dear sister, give her a sweet kiss for her Aunt C. I hope the Lord will make her a good missionary." After Catharine's death, missionaries appropriated and edited her letters to make an example of her pious life in a posthumous memoir. They retained her concluding hope that both she and her addressee would keep the faith, but struck out the final postscript. On the surface, this appears to be a cosmetic editorial decision. Yet when one considers that Catharine Brown was a Cherokee woman referring to herself as an aunt to a white missionary woman's daughter, her letter takes on a new meaning of kinship that goes beyond a sisterhood in Christ. Catharine Brown was born around 1800, born near the foot of Lookout Mountain in the town of Creek Path, which is right outside of modern-day Guntersville, Alabama. She was the most famous Cherokee convert to Christianity with the ABCFM, that long name. While she initially was only interested in receiving an education from the missionaries at Brainerd, under their persuasion, she eventually converted and joined the Mission family, which consisted of heterosexual married couples living together as an extended family, kind of the Mission family. Catharine found a way to navigate the cultural changes that conversion entailed by deploying a Cherokee idiom of kinship. She began writing letters to benefactors in northeastern voluntary societies, women in the mission, and to her brother David, addressing herself to each as sister. These letters were printed in newspapers across the country to publicize the mission's success and raise funds for the ABCFM. They met with widespread acclaim, making her a celebrity of the Second Great Awakening and the first Native American woman to see her writings published extensively during her lifetime. Catharine is part of a longer tradition of Christian Native Americans whose faith gave them the skills and platform to advocate for their people and seek their social and spiritual revitalization at a time of great pressure and duress. While scholars have begun to re-examine Catharine in this light, her fuller project of kin-making and its import have yet to be fully articulated. Several historians have acknowledged the close relationship she formed with the missionaries at Brainerd, yet they are unable to account for why she did so. By applying the lens of Cherokee ideas of kinship to Catharine's life and writings, we can begin to appreciate the full significance of not only what she was trying to accomplish, but to account for her great success in doing so. The story of Catharine Brown and her family reveals the possibilities and limits of the Christian siblinghood and Christian family fostered by the evangelical revivals of the Second Great Awakening, and the fruit such a family tree bears over time for both its Cherokee and white members in the national American family. Catharine Brown arrived at Brainerd on July 9, 1817 to enroll in its school. She had traveled over 100 miles in the summer heat to get there from her home village of Creek Path, yet the lovely and lavishly dressed teenager still made quite the impression on the missionaries. Missionary Moody Hall wrote, quote, she, I suppose, is about 18, fair complexion, well-formed, her appearance genteel and prepossessing. Nature has done much for her. The missionaries made much of her fine clothes and jewelry and noted that she was proud in her bearing. Those are their words. In her later conversion and adoption of Anglo clothing and giving away of her jewelry was taken to be a sign of her civilization, yet something much more complicated was taking place. The mission family at Brainerd strove to model proper Anglo-familial relations of nuclear patriarchal households to the Cherokees that they evangelized to. Yet in practice, they lived in a manner more akin to a traditional Cherokee town than they ever appreciated, with common property ownership and communal living arrangements. At a time when the Cherokee were under great duress, Catharine was convinced to convert and join the mission family to make the missionaries into kin, and thus ease relations between white and Cherokee people. In this, she set out to accomplish what countless Native American women across the continent had done both in marriage and as captives for many centuries. In her 32 surviving letters, Catharine drew on multiple registers of Cherokee and Anglo sisterhood, both intimately in her letters to her Cherokee and missionary kin, and diplomatically to more distant benefactors in New England. Her success was in part due to the fact that she was able to successfully tap into contemporaneous cultural trends among Anglo-American women, such as their prominence and authority during the revivals of the Second Great Awakening, their organization into various voluntary societies, and a broader romantic rhetoric whereby women referred to each other as sisters, whether as close friends or in the service of charitable and religious goals. Both Catharine and the missionaries' respective kin-making projects converged during her lifetime, as each shared several analogous ideas regarding the roles of women, and specifically the role of sisters in their respective societies. Now, as I'm sure you all know, Cherokee society was matrilineal. The building blocks of Cherokee society were the matrilineal clans, and descent was through the mother. As the sole conveyors of Cherokee ancestry, Cherokee women held a particular position of influence, both domestically in the household and diplomatically in relations with other peoples, both European and Native American. In the diplomatic arena, women could turn their kin-making abilities to excellent account, and it was as mothers that Cherokee women spoke with the most authority, implying that they had the same supreme claim over their hearers as a mother did over her children. The most famous of these Cherokee diplomatic mothers was the beloved woman of Choda, Nancy Ward Nanyehi, known to the English as Nancy Ward. Among her other duties, she decided the fate of captives and worked to maintain peaceful relations with white American settlers. While she is famous for addressing herself as a mother to white American commissioners at treaty talks, less well appreciated is the fact that she also employed the language of sisterhood in her speeches to Cherokee men. In 1817, Nancy Ward led a group of 13 Cherokee women in addressing a petition to the National Council, reminding their beloved children and headmen that, quote, we have raised all of you on the land which we now have. So they submitted a final plea, quote, your mothers, your sisters, ask and beg of you not to part with any more of our land. Too infirm to attend, the elderly Nancy Ward sent along her walking stick in her place, along with an entreaty, quote, warriors, take pity and listen to the talks of your sisters. Although I am very old, yet cannot but pity the situation in which you will hear of their minds. I have a great many grandchildren, which I wish them to do well on our land. Among the matrilineal Cherokee, siblings were the closest relations, and a brother was expected to take a protective attitude towards his sister, exemplified by Nancy Ward's urging to the National Council that they take pity on their sisters. This 1817 petition is striking because it simultaneously invokes both the power of mothers and the vulnerability of sisters, serving as both a posturing of strength and this posturing of vulnerability on the part of Cherokee women. They urged their male kinsmen to pay heed to both the authority of their mothers and the dependency of their sisters, their most intimate relation in Cherokee society. Brothers were supposed to take a kind of protective attitude toward their sisters. Catharine Brown drew on similar notions of equality and obligation of her sisterhood in her letters to her white correspondents. White mothers were also accorded an influence in the early 19th century's cult of domesticity, yet white women at large also exerted a powerful cultural influence as sisters, both literal and metaphorical. In the early 19th century, they joined scores of voluntary societies in the evangelical revivals of the Second Great Awakening, in whose meetings members would exhort and counsel their fellow sisters on everything from missionary work abroad to raising godly children at home. Women directed these same exhortations to the men in their families. Religion was seen as the special province of women on account of their unique moral purity. And in church records and popular literature, women frequently bring their wayward husbands, sons, and brothers to Christ. Women formed intensely emotional bonds with female relatives as well, and female friends addressed each other in letters with passionate, quote, assertions of sorority, in the words of one historian. This ideal of shared sisterhood and gender identity impelled them to reach out across class and racial lines to fellow less privileged sisters, in theory, African American, Native American, working class white women, etc. In leading prayer groups of Cherokee women and writing letters to prospective donors, Catharine was able to tap into and benefit from these increasingly authoritative, albeit still very circumscribed roles for women in early 19th century American culture, and find certain kind of Cherokee cultural convergence with it. You'll see here my dear beloved sister, that's to one of the Isabella Hall, whose letter I talked about in the beginning. Finally, it was Anglo-American women who were culturally tasked with writing letters to relatives to reach out for aid, invoke familial obligations, and to maintain kinship ties across the early republic. Catharine explicitly drew upon this aspect of Anglo-American culture in writing to white missionaries and donors. She wrote to one Mrs. A.H., who was a donor in Philadelphia, "But oh, my dear sister, how many of our brethren and sisters are yet in darkness, living without God and without hope in the world? They have precious and immortal souls to be lost or saved." She embraced Jane Murray, the sister of Isabella Hall, the biological sister, who was living in New York. She wrote her, quote, "Dear friend, I am writing this to you just as I would talk to your dear sister Hall, who I hope is a dear sister in Christ. I love you, though I have never seen you. Sister Hall has often spoken of you and told me that you love the Savior Jesus Christ. Therefore, I rejoice to tell you that we are sisters in Christ." In her letters, Catharine Brown met her white addressees halfway across a bridge of fictive kinship. It was on account of such sororal rhetoric that white Americans resonated so strongly with Catharine's letters, in which she both addressed them as siblings and sisters and referred to herself as a sister. Her fervid avowals of sisterhood and pious exhortations struck a deep chord with white readers. This is from one contributor to the Religious Intelligencer, which was a religious newspaper in Connecticut. Quote, "I have a strong hope that Catharine Brown's letter has been sent to me for good. The effect produced by the sight of the writing of an Indian has been considerable. I put it into the hands of a person who was a stranger to religion. He returned it with eyes filled with tears, unable to make one remark. Several times during the afternoon, his eyes were filled to overflowing, and a mournful shade of thought crossed the brow of this hitherto thoughtless character." This same stranger to religion then proposed having her letter read to the town council, whose members were then moved to donate the money, quote, usually expended for wine, to the Cherokee school, end quote. A total of $16 that had been, quote, formerly wasted in reveling, end quote. Catharine's letters were read aloud in Sunday schools and missionary societies across the country to great effect, inspiring pious sentiments, tears, and donations. They were trumpeted as incontrovertible evidence of the ability of Native Americans to become civilized. One contributor to the Concord Observer wrote, "Does not the case of Catharine Brown afford the strongest hope and confidence that among this unhappy people there will be found many who at the last day shall stand before the throne clothed in the robes of Christ's righteousness?" However, Catharine's mixed race background put her in a tenuous position with regards to her acceptance into the national American family. As a fair-skinned Cherokee woman in Anglo dress bearing a very English name, Catharine Brown was a source of fascination to many who saw her in person. One observer, visitor to the Brainerd Mission, recorded in his journal that she appeared to be, quote, probably 1/4 Indian. She was dressed in the American style, and but for the small dark eye, prominent cheekbones, and glossy hair, would have passed well for an American lady. Another visitor wrote, quote, no person, not even a Cherokee, who should enter the mission family as a stranger, would in the least suspect but that she was one of the mission sisters from the north. She is not darker than half of our young ladies, end quote. One contributor writing to the Religious Intelligencer under the name Thomas admitted that he too struggled with doubt concerning the efficacy of evangelizing the heathen, and what he had read of Catharine Brown, quote, staggered me considerably. How an Indian girl, even if she was converted and civilized, could be handsome and equal to a circle of our genteel young ladies in New England, I could not tell. One of the missionaries even showed him some of the jewelry she had donated and some of the letters she had written, and he writes about that too, like, I couldn't believe it until I saw her jewelry and her letters. However, upon learning that she was, quote, part white, the, quote, mystery of her appearance and her conversion, quote, in some measure vanished, since she had become a Christian and was civilized and part white too. She might have a soul that was worth saving and be ranked among the human species. Like other mixed-race people in the early 19th century, Catharine was caught in a bind of hardening racial attitudes and increasing refusal by white Americans to admit to the improvability of Africans and Indians, something which had been touted as a possibility only a few generations earlier. Earlier in the 18th century, there was this idea of, oh, everyone's equal and everyone can learn via education, but this would due to increasing racism in the 19th century, that was, considered, impossible, this kind of biological essentialism. Mixed-race individuals such as Catharine occupied an ambiguous position on the continuum of racial superiority, as they were considered by many white Americans to be the only people of color that were capable of any improvement at all on account of their partial white ancestry. We see this tension around Catharine's Cherokee background in surviving artistic depictions of her, which overwhelmingly portray her as a young white woman. Apparently, conversion to a new religion entailed conversion to a new race. So we're going to look right now at some surviving illustrations of her. This is the frontispiece of the second edition of her memoir. This is supposed to depict her dictating her final letter on her deathbed to her brother David as she was dying of consumption. And Laura Potter, one of the missionary women, is taking dictation for her. And by all appearances, her skin seems a little bit darker, but other than that, she basically is dressed and appears to be a young white woman in her dress here and how she's depicted. Another one here. This is her from the 1832 version, Catharine as a native Indian girl. So this is kind of before her conversion, and so she's kind of depicted in this is kind of right, the noble savage, right, kind of, rhetoric, and she's watching these deer leaping by, and she's dressed in this kind of, tunic and beads, and she still appears very fair, but her back is to us. But this is kind of out of all the surviving illustrations, this is where she appears, quote, most Indian, end quote. But, just because of how, the clothes she's wearing. This is another illustration of her after her conversion. Again, she appears to be a young white woman by all accounts. Her skin's very fair, her dress, all that. She's praying in the woods. She often went to pray in the woods. Here, this is from the London edition. Here, again, she's very fair. She's cast her hat aside, and her book is open in front of her, and she's praying. Again, she appears to be a young white woman in complexion and dress. And then finally, here, this is a book that was published in rural Maine of this local author. And this is a kind of a woodcut representation of her. And again, she appears to be a young white woman in dress and complexion. So all of that. And here's an acrostic poem he wrote about her, Catharine Brown. You can see kind of down here, kind of about her name. And it's kind of like a overly romanticized, no child of the forest kind of poem. Catharine's beauty was widely remarked upon by those who saw her in person. Missionary Daniel Buttrick harbored a very painful crush on her for which he castigated himself repeatedly in his diary. And while she received multiple offers of marriage from, quote, respectable white men, she declined them all. To missionary Moody Hall, Catharine's rejection of her marriage proposals, all, quote, very flattering as to this world, was further evidence of her noble nature. He wrote, quote, God had designed her for a more noble purpose than to shine like a glowworm in darkness and ignorance. Long-standing European squeamishness about the perceived sexual licentiousness of Native American women was compounded by the turn of the 19th century by increasing hostility towards interracial sex. Catharine's celibacy thus made her an even more appealing figure than she arguably would have been if she had married and had children of her own, which she never did. She was in a measure able to overcome her racial background by acting in the domestic role of a spinster sister or aunt, just as many unmarried white women did at the time as celibate aunts and daughters in the families of their married siblings and for their aging parents. I also just want to note she could have married one of the Cherokee women at the mission, Lydia Lowry, daughter of George Lowry, ended up marrying Mila Hoyt, one of the sons, and they had a family. So it wasn't like, oh, you're a nun now, right? Like you could get married. I'm saying the fact that she didn't made her a more kind of appealing figure to the white public. At a time when Native American women were by and large considered to be sexually rapacious, her celibacy was considered to be nearly as miraculous and as commendable as her conversion to Christianity itself. There were poems commemorating her after her death, and they were in part celebrations of her chastity. One goes, this is really cringy poems, my apologies in advance. One of them praised the flower of the valley for her innocence and spotless spirit. Again, this kind of focus on her virginity. Another one goes, quote, pour forth thy voice, O buried maid, and gently warn the sister throng, who while their raven locks they braid, and lightly weave the heathen song, shall over thy grave a vigil keep, and true to nature fondly weep. I know, it's terrible. I didn't write it, thank God. While for white women, being unmarried was merely an incidental detail, for Catharine as a Cherokee woman, it was a positive virtue. Put another way, she did much of the work of Cherokee wives and mothers while safely being neither. Now at this point, it's worth taking a moment to review Catharine Brown's Cherokee family tree. While Catharine herself was portrayed in missionary writings as a model sister of the Anglo-American national family, her own Cherokee family did not meet Anglo norms of nuclear propriety, which the ABCFM conveniently left out in descriptions of her. Over the course of his life, Catharine's father, John Brown Sr., had a total of 3 wives. With his first wife, he had the eldest son, Richard. I've left him out just to simplify this table. And with his second wife, Sarah, here, he had Catharine, David, and John Brown Jr. By his third wife, Betsy, over here, he had 4 children, Polly, Alexander, Susan, and Edward. Sarah herself had 2 children from prior unions, Betsy and Walter Weber. In a footnote in Catharine's memoir describing her family in detail, the editor writes that Sarah and Betsy lived with Mr. Brown at the same time, but some difficulty arising, the latter separated from him. By the time Catharine came to Brainerd, both Betsy and Walter, Sarah's prior children from her prior unions, her half-siblings, were living in the Arkansas Territory. There was a big, controversy about the pre-removal to the Arkansas. So several of the Brown family were already out there. While Anderson gives a fairly thorough recounting of David's extended family in the memoir, he leaves out a potentially explosive detail. The fact is, it strongly appears from records I found that Sarah and Betsy were in fact mother and daughter, that he was with mother and daughter at the same time and having children by them at the same time. I've talked to Jack Baker about this. This was not unheard of among Cherokees up to the early 1900s. There was another a white trader named Hellfire Jack. He also had a mother and daughter in the same time in the same union. It was usually in a matrilineal society. It was usually more common to be with sisters, but occasionally a mother would bring a daughter from a previous union. The daughter would grow up, and then she would start having children with her. So that was not unheard of. And Cephas Washburn writes this just as a fact. One of the missionaries writes about this. The 2 Betsies that the editor names as being Sarah's daughter from her first marriage and John Brown Sr.'s third wife were in fact the same person. This made Polly, if this is true, and I have reason to believe it is, this made Polly, Susan, Alexander, and Edward not only Catharine's half-siblings, but her half-nieces and nephews as well, suggesting a whole new meaning to Catharine's self-designation as an aunt to the missionaries' children. Remember how she was referring to herself as an aunt to the young white children? Indeed, one of the most striking features is the extent to which Catharine addresses herself as an aunt to the young children of the missionaries, like in the first letter I introduced. This is reprinted only once in the memoir, and in a postscript where Catharine urges one missionary couple, the Williamses, to teach their children how to say Aunt Catharine. In a footnote, the editor, Anderson, explains away this title by writing that for the white readers, like, why is she calling herself an aunt? So the editor writes that the wife, Matilda Williams, quote, had always been peculiarly dear to her from their first acquaintance, and like an older sister had guided her youthful steps in the path of peace. However, in the context of the matrilineal Cherokee, where the sisters of one's mothers were basically equivalent to mothers themselves and even addressed by the same term, this appears to be more of a statement of social parity rather than a younger sister looking up to an older sister, as the editor tried to frame it. The fact that the editor omitted the other instance, which I talked about earlier, where Catharine referred to herself again as an aunt, may suggest that her self-designation as an aunt was too confusing and perhaps discomfiting to be included in more than one letter in her memoir. Catharine's parents and numerous siblings and half-siblings converted not long after her. We have multiple surviving letters, not only David Brown, her brother, who went on to have an illustrious career in his own right. He was away at the Foreign Mission School in Cornwall, and she wrote multiple letters to him, and he wrote a couple surviving letters to her. We also have a surviving letter from their parents, John and Sarah, and one from David and Catharine's brother, John. John wrote another letter to David that was printed in the newspapers, and then we have a surviving letter from John and Sarah Brown, the parents, written to David while he was at school. These letters were largely excised from Catharine's memoir, making her out to be a more exemplary and isolated figure in her letter writing than she actually was. Yet in examining the surviving letters written by her family, we see that they also use the same syncretic language of Christian Cherokee kinship that she did. For example, in the surviving letter of the parents John and Sarah, written to David while he was away at school in Connecticut, they write that the missionaries, quote, call us father and mother, and we are glad to have them call us so, end quote. The missionaries also referred to older missionary couples at Brainerd as father and mother as a term of respect on account of their older age, but this probably had deeper meanings of obligation to John and Sarah Brown as Cherokees. We see this example with missionary Daniel Buttrick. He visited this Cherokee chief called the Boot in Turkeytown, and they smoked together, and then the Boot asked Buttrick to, requested that he call him and his wife father and mother, because he was now their son, and Buttrick accepted this. So there's this kind of diplomacy and kinship that went, this kind of shared idiom that Catharine was kind of able to embody with her family in her lifetime. The Browns also wrote letters to maintain contact between the Arkansas Territory and the Old Nation, as well as to discuss the question of emigration. So Betsy and Walter and some of the other half-siblings are already out in the Arkansas, and we have a couple surviving letters. They were writing letters back and forth to kind of keep, track, keep in contact across the vast expanse. And also, there was a lot of painful discussion about should we move to the Arkansas too. And the letter that John and Sarah wrote to David, they write in part like, we want you and Walter to be decided about us because we're not sure what to do. Like, should we emigrate or should we stay? So that was a very kind of painful topic of discussion for the Brown family. It's probably an unparalleled look into a Cherokee family deciding whether or not to move to the Arkansas. So that's one reason the letters are important. Catherine was especially close to her brother David and wrote him numerous letters while he was away at the Foreign Mission School in Cornwall, urging him on in the pursuit of his studies. She wrote in one part, quote, "Be faithful, my dear brother, and pray without ceasing for our dear people. Let us work while the day lasts, for the time will come when we cannot plead with sinners to flee from the wrath to come." A number of her letters to David are published in newspapers across the country. For the missionaries and newspaper readers, her exhortation of David was very much in keeping with this Anglo-cultural expectation, again, that women would lead their family members, their male relatives, to Christ, and sisters would exhort their brothers. Missionaries also wrote letters to newspaper readers informing them of the Brown family's activities, further fostering the sense of intimacy in this effective kind of textual community. So the white readers could read about the Browns and then possibly even write to them themselves. And so this is kind of like, extended kind of family. For example, William, a missionary Chamberlain, informed the, quote, ladies of Greensboro of Vermont of Catherine teaching Cherokee girls at Creek Path and her success in converting her parents. And missionary Sarah Hoyt happily reported to donor Albert North in New York that David had just left for New England for his education. Evangelical readers could thus read about the Browns just as they would read letters from and about their own family, and possibly even write to them themselves. And then Catherine would sometimes write back, and then that would be reprinted in the newspapers. The Brown family was celebrated as having completely reformed. Quote, "The hopeful conversion of Mr. Brown and several members of his family is a remarkable display of divine grace," wrote someone in the Pittsburgh Recorder. 5 years ago, not an individual of this family knew anything of the gospel, but now both parents, 2 sons, 3 daughters, and a son's wife are apparently the children of God. Someone in the Christian Secretary asked, why should not the gospel be preached to all the families on our continent too? So OCO TV, a Cherokee docuseries featuring Cherokee culture, they did a biography segment on Catharine Brown, which I was a historical consultant for. So it's on YouTube. You can go search it and find it. It's like a very short, like 6-minute. This is just a screenshot of the actress playing her with another student. So at the mission, Catherine engaged in this daily work alongside the other women of the mission, cooking, sewing, cleaning, childcare, the daily round of, women's labor and housework. But relations could be more complicated too, and we see some glimpses of this in the surviving records. Historian Martha Blauvelt has written of the emotion work that young women were called on to perform in the early republic to produce appropriate feelings and regulate their existing ones in writing and social interactions. Like many young white women of her day, Catherine was called upon to perform this emotional regulation as well, but there was an extra kind of layer and tension because she was being racialized and the scrutiny she was under as a Cherokee woman. While she was able to successfully voice appropriately pious sentiments in her letters, her day-to-day life among the missionaries could sometimes be more difficult. In an unpublished letter, missionary Laura Potter informed the secretary of the ABCFM that on one occasion she rebuked Catherine for some expressions which she felt were, quote, rather unguarded. Catherine was so upset that she then retired to her room for 2 full hours. That's her words. Laura also reported that on another occasion she, quote, once heard a person rail at her with much ill nature for not having performed a small task which he requested might be done, but which other engagement forbid at the time. She heard with great composure without answering a word and then quietly took her seat and performed the work, though under no obligation to do it. So she just kind of quietly took it. And so that was suggestive of a host of virtues, and also there was this kind of Cherokee cultural of like kind of communal, peace and keeping the peace and stuff, so that kind of fed into it as well, of kind of like group harmony. Catherine was never comfortable with her celebrity and was very embarrassed by the gifts and praise showered on her by her many visitors, a fact noted approvingly in her memoir as evidence of her modesty. Above all, she was especially upset that a number of her letters were published without her permission. This is a brand new letter I found in the newspapers. Dear brother, she addressed one anonymous correspondent. As you said, I must write the same as I would to my brother David. I would freely comply with your request did you not read my letters to so many different persons. I thank you that you do not put it in print, for I do not think my letters fit to go before the public. However, I will put confidence in you once more and trust you will suffer my unworthy letters to remain silent. This confidence was misplaced as this letter was reprinted in 2 different newspapers. After her death, her obituary printed in the Alabama Republican reported that her numerous correspondents, quote, often took the liberty of publishing her letters without consulting her wishes. This circumstance, so far from exciting her vanity, actually gave her pain and was the occasion of her ceasing to correspond with numbers who were very anxious to maintain an intercourse with her. Such was her retiring modesty and unfeigned humility. This sentence was struck out in the many reprints of her obituary across the country. Laura also writes in another anecdote about Catharine's upset at a number of these letters being published without her permission, and she quotes Catharine as saying, "I suppose that they wanted to show that an Indian could improve, but one or two of my letters would have served just as well as anything else that I have written." So she was very upset. So you can hear her kind of upset, coming out in that. While she was the first Native American woman to have her writings extensively published during her lifetime, it is very important to remember that this was not with her full consent. And again, there were plenty of white people this time having their writings published in the newspaper without their permission. So again, it's part of broader American culture, but it's also she's being kind of openly exoticized as a Cherokee woman, and there's a whole other layer of pain there, for her as well, obviously. Her obituary was not the only writing concerning her that was edited. 2 years after her death, from consumption on July 18th, 1823, her memoir made its debut. Within 6 months of its release, it had sold 2,500 copies. This is comparable to the sales The Last of the Mohicans made in its first year of publication, just to give you an idea of what a blockbuster success this memoir was. And it went on to have no fewer than 11 reprintings over the course of the 19th century. It was translated into French and Choctaw, and editions were also published in the UK, in London, and York, and Edinburgh. Written and edited by Rufus Anderson, the assistant secretary of the ABCFM, it contained her diary and 18 of her letters, 16 of which were published for the first time. Of these letters, 11 have been preserved in their original manuscript form and make for a revealing look as to how they were framed and edited for publication. Much of Catharine's stronger and darker language was deleted from her letters. In one omitted passage, she angsts about the unconverted to the halls. She writes, quote, "But oh, the dreadful thought for those who have not an interest in the Lord Jesus. No hope for the world to come. They travel on as though they were blind and asleep until their souls are forever lost in hell." So here's the original manuscript version. Here's all the language Anderson deleted. And here's the memoir version. This isn't a very extreme example, but you can see kind of how what we would consider very heavily intrusive editing practices. In other deleted passages from her diary, Catharine writes of the, quote, warfare she experiences in trying to conform and berates herself for being so stupid. Such excisions made Catharine a much more docile and palatable figure to a broader white audience and downplayed her inner turmoil about her conversion. Other deletions speak to tensions within the Brown family themselves regarding the missionaries. Catharine writes in one letter that her mother is very upset about her going to school and doesn't want her going to school, so there is tension about that. Another letter, she writes that her parents are, quote, very much against her staying at the mission. And in her final letter to David, dictated to David on her deathbed, she adds this lengthy postscript that their half-brother, quote, needs one thing, that is religion, exemplified by his working on the Sabbath. So while nearly all of Catharine's immediate relatives ended up converting, these omissions made the conversion of the Brown family appear to be somewhat less troubled than it actually was. In Catharine Brown's memoir, Rufus Anderson praised the Brown family's piety. It is gratifying to be able to remark that not one of them has hitherto dishonored the Christian profession, and that all who survive are believed to be the humble followers of the Lord Jesus. This sentence remained throughout successive editions of the memoir, even as her relatives met varying fates, including several being on the Trail of Tears, which I'll talk about in a moment. Alexander, one of her half-siblings, who was later excommunicated for adultery. They don't go into detail about that. It's possible he may have just taken on another wife and polygamy, and the missionaries weren't happy about that. And her brother David, whom she had exhorted so warmly in her letters, became estranged from most of the missionaries, in part because they disapproved of his political activities on behalf of the Cherokee nation, which made him too worldly, in the words of one of them. Yet the biggest contributing factor to Cherokee alienation from the missionaries was the scandalous marriage of David's classmate Elias Boudinot to Harriet Gold. Does everyone know about the Cornwall kind of fracas? Yeah. A white woman in 1826. It rocked the town of Cornwall and led to the closing of the foreign mission school, which David had attended in hopes of becoming a missionary. In one of many letters written to Harriet in an attempt to dissuade her from the marriage, her brother-in-law complained that her fiancé, Elias, quote, had the good example of David Brown before him in marrying a Cherokee woman rather than a white woman. David Brown had married Rachel Lowry, who was the daughter of Rachel Lowry, the future assistant principal chief. And so her brother-in-law is basically saying, why couldn't Elias have just married a Cherokee woman like David did? Why did he have to go marry a white woman? It's not clear whether this letter ever got back to David, but in a letter to the Secretary Everts, David's anger over the uproar is palpable. Many white men, he noted, quote, have married Cherokee ladies without censure, so how can it be thought wicked for us to marry among them, especially if some of our white sisters are pleased with such connections? Such questions are the common topics of conversation among us, and we know not how to understand them, end quote. Unspoken in this letter is the fact that his deceased sister, Catharine, had corresponded with both Harriet and her sister Flora as a sister. While the celibate Catharine could join the national family, it was clear that other Cherokees would not enjoy the same admission. In one of her letters to Flora Gould, Catharine had written, quote, "I hope indeed we are of one family," end quote, and it was a painful discovery that this was not the case. In spite of the white public's enthusiastic embrace of Catharine Brown as a sister, several of her Cherokee relatives ended up on the Trail of Tears, among them her half-sister and niece, Polly Gilbreath, her sister-in-law, Rachel Laurie Brown, David's widow, David had died by that point, and Rachel's children, Catherine and John, Catherine's niece and nephew, who they had named after David's dead siblings. It is the height of tragic irony that the niece and namesake of the so-called Cherokee sister found herself as a child on the Trail of Tears. She was about 9 or 10. Rachel was by this time remarried to a man named Nelson Orr, who came to a very bad end during the chaos of removal. In the journal he kept during removal, Buttrick noted his death, noting that Nelson Orr and Rachel had separated 2 weeks prior on account of his abusive behavior. Nelson entered a grocery store on the Sabbath to drink and gamble, in the course of which, quote, he was engaged in a quarrel and had his body gashed and cut to pieces. Rachel arrived in company with a pious white woman and asked him if he wanted someone to pray for him. And he allegedly responded that there would be, quote, time enough to pray when the devil came for him. He soon died, end quote. Theda Perdue writes that the stress and tension produced by the removal crisis accounts for a post-removal increase in domestic violence. Missionaries report that men, helpless to prevent seizure of their property and assaults on themselves and their families, vented their frustrations by beating their wives and children. Some women were treated so badly by their husbands that they left them, and this dislocation contributed to the chaos of the removal in the Cherokee Nation in the late 1830s. So he may have been already abusive before then, but obviously the chaos and hardship of removal contributed probably to the stress they were under. By far the most widely reprinted editions of the memoir were the 4 editions reprinted by the American Sunday School Union in Philadelphia, which distributed hundreds of thousands of copies to Sunday school children over the course of the 19th century. One of these editions in the United States was reprinted in the years of 1831, which, as you may know, the same year the Cherokee Nation was ruled to be a domestic dependent nation in Cherokee Nation v. Georgia. And another edition was reprinted in all years 1838, the same year the Cherokees were forced to embark upon the Trail of Tears. So it's a measure of just how disconnected Catharine's marketed story was from the actual trajectory and trials of the Cherokee Nation and her family at the time. Catharine Brown's niece, Catharine Brown Daniels, was about 9 to 10 years old when she endured the Trail of Tears, and she passed away in 1902 at approximately the age of 74 in Tahlequah. This is from her obituary in the Cherokee Advocate. Mrs. Daniels was born in the Old Nation, now the state of Georgia. Upon the removal of the Cherokee to this country, she came with her people. She was devoted to her relatives and loved her Cherokee people and was their unswerving friend. Mercifully, she did not live long enough to see her unfortunate people lose their tribal government. But her friends and relatives could rest assured, quote, that her soul has gone to her heavenly Father, who is a just and merciful God. In tribute to her character, her obituary further related that her, quote, kindness to all in Christian ways made her many friends, so much so that this, quote, Christian lady was affectionately called Aunt by all who had the pleasure of knowing her, just as her aunt, Catharine, referred to herself in her letters as Aunt. In some ways, Catharine Brown's niece resembled her famous aunt. In her letters, Catharine Brown had also indicated that she wished to be called Aunt by the children of the white missionaries, and her niece later bore the same honorific title. Unlike her aunt, however, David's daughter had been forced to embark upon the Trail of Tears as a young child. During the negotiations leading up to the Treaty of No-Chota, one of the many thorny issues that arose was the question of who would compensate the missionaries for their property in the East, which they would be abandoning. The ABCFM had made clear from the start that the Cherokees would not have to pay for anything from the missionaries. However, officials from the federal government now argued that the Cherokee should reimburse the ABCFM for their improvements. One of these men was the Commissioner for Indian Affairs, John F. Schermerhorn, who the Cherokee absolutely despised, who argued that the Cherokees ought to reimburse the ABCFM for mission improvements since they had enjoyed the benefit of them. By way of illustration, he, quote, referred to Catharine Brown as a specimen to show what good the Cherokees had derived from mission stations, end quote. While it was ultimately decided the federal government would compensate the ABCFM, the fact that Catharine Brown was brought up at the Treaty of No-Chota is a testament to her enduring power as a figure in Anglo-American culture. This is actually a depiction of Pocahontas, but she becomes part of this kind of Indian princess stereotype, which I'll talk about in a minute. Over the course of the 19th century, Catharine Brown was frequently held up to young white children as a model daughter and sister. Quote, if the Spirit of God influences you, your first concern will be for home, wrote a contributor to the British publication The Children's Friend. Oh, my dear children, if every one of you acted like Catharine Brown, how soon should we hear of family after family, village, town, city, the nation, islands, continents, the world, ascribing the kingdom, power, and glory to the only true God. In the Youth's Companion, another contributor wrote that he had visited Catharine Brown's grave. Quote, some of the flowers which I plucked from her grave I still retain. Catharine Brown is now in heaven. Dear children, do you think you are prepared to meet her there? He urged his young readers to pray just as earnestly as Catharine had prayed to David, for David. Pray for their own siblings just as Catharine had prayed for David. Quote, "Dear children, have you not souls as precious as David Brown's? And will you not pray as earnestly for yourselves as Catharine did for her brother? And children, do not cease praying till you feel as sure as she did, that God has heard your prayers and that you are prepared to meet her and her brother in heaven." Multiple reviews of her memoir extolled her beauty, piety, and virtue. One writer made an extraordinary claim while speculating on the cause of her early death. This is kind of darkly hilarious. Quote, "She had probably injured herself from too close application to her studies. This change from flying through the groves and paddling the canoe to such a sedentary life, which she must have led, and acquiring so much knowledge in so short a time, would have naturally undermined the strongest constitution." That's right, she died from studying and working too hard. This assertion was reprinted into the 20th century about her. Besides underscoring her fate as a doomed Indian, such language also suggested that Native Americans, and women in general, were not cut out for academic study, and thus Native Americans were not cut out for civilization. Like Icarus, Catharine's ambition had led to her demise. Catharine continued to be commemorated as a, quote, "little forest maid and untrained Indian maiden of supreme beauty, piety, amiability, and virtue" into the 20th century, especially in local histories published in newspapers in the South. This was written by local historian Mary Gordon Duffy for the Birmingham Age Herald in 1909. Quote, "Over hill and valley she went among the helpless and suffering as an angel ministrant. Stern warriors who would not attend church asked her to kneel down by their side and pray for them, and rising from their bended knees, those hardened sinners were the first to arrive to attend service on Sunday. So noiselessly did she move about in her ministrations that the Indians called her the lily that floats on the water." I can assure you there is zero evidence that this was her Cherokee name at all. I'm more qualified speaking this than anyone. Zero evidence that that was her Cherokee name. Descriptions of her sexual allure also became a prominent motif. Catharine is described as a beautiful squaw upon whom the boys showered their trinkets and lavished their admiration, wrote a contributor for the Missionary Voice in 1931. Writer Robert Sparks Walker, who wrote Torchlight to the Cherokees, which is a prominent Pulitzer Prize nominated book about Brainerd Mission, also made similar claims about, quote, "pretty Catharine Brown being loaded with trinkets from male admirers." Again, there's no evidence of this in the historical record. Claims which he would write about in his book. One contributor to the Advertiser, Gleam of Guntersville, Alabama, wrote, "Would such a young, beautiful woman be willing to engage in the manual labor required of all students? Rarely have teachers been more agreeably surprised." As late as 1976, writer Samuel Carter described her as the, quote, "siren-like Catharine Brown, shapely, ravishingly beautiful, and queen-like in her manner." In these writings, Catharine Brown was remembered as a doomed and dying Indian, a chaste and pious virgin, and a seductive Indian maid. Over 1,000 miles away, in what would become the state of Oklahoma, Catharine Brown was remembered and commemorated quite differently. And this is with the article here. For over 25 years, there was a Catharine Brown Missionary Society based in Tahlequah, run by Cherokees for Cherokees. A Presbyterian organization, its members held prayer meetings and sewing circles, visited people in need of assistance or nursing, and held fairs, festivals, and concerts to raise money for church and boarding school repairs, among other objectives. Had ice cream socials, concerts, just a very active organization for over 20 years in Tahlequah. It also hosted receptions and talks in the Tahlequah community, at which a variety of topics were discussed, such as, quote, "Are Christians responsible for Sabbath desecration?" A debate. In 1900, the Catharine Brown Society held its annual praise meeting at a Presbyterian church, which was crowded to its full capacity, according to the newspaper. According to the writer for the Tahlequah Arrow, the members of the society were, quote, "again ingratiated themselves into the hearts of our people, showing themselves to be true, energetic, and tireless missionary workers." After the choir sang and a scripture lesson was read, a member presented a life sketch of Catharine Brown. Her, quote, "conception of womanly uprightness was remarkable, and it is only such women who are capable of doing permanent good anywhere in the broad fields of Christian labor or in the narrow circle of home life. Thus Catharine Brown could pursue no other life than that which all high womanhood would be bound to respect and emulate." Catharine was not just an exceptional Cherokee, the speaker insinuated, she was an exceptional woman and a model for women everywhere, Cherokee and otherwise, to emulate. In the memoir and subsequent writings, Catharine had frequently been described as proud when she first arrived, an account of her beauty and the clothes and jewelry she was wearing. Yes, she had been proud, asserted this member of the society, but in that she was, quote, "like all comely women, savage or civilized." Further, quote, "she came from a race that was proud and warlike, a race that renounced the protection of Iroquois Federation, deeming itself strong enough to meet any foe. Was it then any wonder, quote, that she was proud with a high opinion of herself? At the same time possessing genteelness and modesty that should display her finery, clothing, and ornaments? This is no apology for Catharine Brown. Her life needs none. Her time on earth was devoted to the uplifting of her people, in the schoolroom as a teacher and in the prayer meeting as a leader. Although her life was short, quote, within its narrow span, who can measure the value of good she gave to the world, or the crosses that she bore, or the souls that she won?" And so that was said at this meeting of the Catharine Brown Society. And then this is a headline called "Catharine's Workers," you can see here. And it's about some of their activities, The activities, services, writings, and speeches of the Catharine Brown Society depicted her as much more proactive and powerful in the service of her fellow Cherokees. Her pride was construed as a virtue rather than a defect. It was pride in being a beautiful, accomplished, and ambitious young woman, as well as pride in coming from a noble race of people, the Cherokee. Rather than focusing on her death, as so many white commemorations did, the Catharine Brown Society celebrated her life and on her having a living legacy that continued within the society and the rest of the Cherokee people. Over the years, Catharine was isolated from her Cherokee relatives and the Cherokee people at large, a trend that was exacerbated as the 19th century wore on, as multiple editions of the memoir came out and her relatives met varying fates. Yet Catharine would not have thought of herself and her kin-making project apart from her Cherokee kin, and we cannot afford to either. She engaged in acts of linguistic and social translation to make her relationships to the missionaries and the white public meaningful, yet we have yet to recognize what she was trying to accomplish by this. Finally, the life and legacy of Catharine Brown sheds light on the prevailing stereotype of the Indian princess, which I think she was appropriate to kind of, feed into. The 19th century was a time of much enthusiastic rhetoric about getting Native Americans to join the national family. The story of Catharine Brown and her family has much to tell us about who can and cannot belong to our national family in the early republic and beyond. Thank you. That was it.